Welcome to Relative, our family mess. Here, I bring you the raw, unspoken stories of older men betrayed by the very families they spent a lifetime protecting, and the dark secrets hidden within the modern home. Now, here is today's story.
What do you do when the son you raised looks you straight in the eye and treats you like a stranger? My son did exactly that at his own housewarming party, while his wife made my 64-year-old wife stand in the kitchen like a maid. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a scene. I am Frank Callahan, and what I quietly did in the weeks that followed cost a man everything he owned. Let me know in the comments if you've ever had to teach a loved one the hardest lesson of your life. And if so, hit like and subscribe to the channel. Doyle's estate gleamed as if it had stepped out of a magazine completely unrelated to real life. A jazz quartet played somewhere near the pool, the notes drifting lazily across the meticulously manicured lawn. The champagne glasses clinked together in a constant, unending rhythm, and laughter rose and fell in bursts, loud and flamboyant, the kind of laughter one uses for attention rather than for enjoyment. That evening, Eleanor wore her finest dress, the pale blue one she reserved for church and celebrations, paired with a wool coat to ward off the October chill and ankle boots. She looked beautiful in my eyes. She was always so simply dressed. We had driven 40 minutes to get there through the gate, with its stone lions and uniformed servants, into a world where a person's worth was judged by the brand on their shoes. I noticed Vanessa's gaze fell upon us the moment we stepped through the door. She didn't smile. Instead, she turned to my son, grabbed his arm and pulled him a few feet away close enough that I could still hear every word if I tried to listen. And I did. "I told you not to invite them," she said, her voice dropping to a hiss, but sharp enough to drown out the music. "Look at your mother. Isn't that a dress from a decade ago? And her boots are still covered in suburban mud. My father's guests are the city's elite, Ryan. They'll laugh us to death." Ryan glanced at us, and for a brief moment, I saw something flash in his eyes, something that might have once been embarrassment. Then it vanished, replaced by the same awkward, apologetic smile he'd given Vanessa since the day I met her. "They won't be staying long," he mumbled in response. "Just let them greet a few people." Eleanor heard nothing. She was too busy gazing at the chandeliers, the waiters moving among the crowd with silver trays, the whole ridiculously extravagant scene. I said nothing. I'd spent my whole life learning when to speak and when to observe, and that night, I just observed. For almost an hour, we wandered along the edge of the party like strangers at a wedding where only half were invited. Eleanor tried in her gentle way to strike up a conversation with a woman in an emerald dress who was discussing a skiing trip to a resort in which I had actually owned a controlling stake for 11 years, though of course she would never know that. Nobody at that party knew who I really was. That was precisely and always has been the bottom line. Then Vanessa reappeared this time, carrying a plate of appetizers, and with an expression I recognized as the characteristic cruelty of someone who had never been refused. She walked straight to Eleanor, interrupting her mid-sentence. "I'm so sorry," she said, though her tone lacked any remorse. "But we're arranging seating for close friends and family in the main hall for a toast, and space is limited. Perhaps you two would be more comfortable in the kitchen. There's a lovely little table next to the pantry. You wouldn't even notice what you're missing." Eleanor blinked, momentarily confused, as one might be when kindness is taken for granted throughout their life, and cruelty simply isn't immediately apparent. She looked at Ryan. Ryan looked down at his shoes. "Go on, Mother," he said softly. "It's fine, it's just for a bit." I watched my wife of 41 years carry her own small plate of food into a kitchen full of caterers rushing past her with trays, and sit down alone on a folding stool beside the pantry door, while 40 guests in the next room raised their glasses to a marriage built on nothing but appearances. I stood in the doorway and watched her eat in silence, her shoulders drawn in, trying to take up as little space as possible in a room that was never meant to hold her. I did not walk in and cause a scene. I did not raise my voice, though something in my chest had gone very cold and very still, the way the air goes still before a hard frost. I simply walked over, pulled up a second stool beside her, and sat down. I told her the appetizers looked better in here anyway. She managed a small laugh, though her eyes were bright with tears she refused to let fall. We left 20 minutes later before the toasts, before the cake slipping out through the side door, while the jazz quartet played on behind us. Ryan did not walk us to the car. Nobody noticed us go. I drove the whole way home in silence, my hand steady on the wheel, my mind anything but. Eleanor stared out the passenger window, her reflection ghostly against the passing street lights. I kept thinking of something my father used to say, that the quietest men in the room are usually the ones holding the most weight. I had built an empire on being underestimated. I had never once imagined my own son would be the one who underestimated me most. As we turned onto our road, past the old fence line and the dark silhouette of the barn, a strange unease settled into my gut, something heavier than the humiliation of that kitchen stool. It was the feeling of a man who senses a storm long before the sky has given him any reason to. The house was dark when we pulled into the driveway, the porch light flickering the way it had for months, a small repair I kept meaning to get to, and never did. I helped Eleanor out of the car, my hand under her elbow, the way it had been for over 4 decades, and we walked up the gravel path together without a word. Inside the house smelled the way it always did of wood smoke and lavender, and the faint trace of the roast we hadn't finished the night before. It was a smell that had nothing to do with marble floors or imported champagne, and in that moment, I had never been more grateful for it. Eleanor sat down heavily on the edge of our bed and began working the small buttons of her cardigan with fingers that trembled just slightly. I knelt in front of her and finished the task myself, the way I might have unlaced a child's shoes. She let me. That alone told me how tired she was, how much that kitchen stool had cost her. "I'm sorry," I told her. "I should have said something." She shook her head, and when she finally spoke, her voice was steady, steadier than I expected. "Don't." It would have embarrassed Ryan in front of all those people. I didn't want that. There it was again, the thing that had defined her for as long as I'd known her, this instinct to protect everyone else's comfort before her own. I thought of the young woman I married, the one who used to argue with the base commander's wife about fair wages for the enlisted families, who never once in her life sat quietly while someone else was mistreated. I wondered when exactly the years had worn that fire down to embers, and I already knew the answer. It had started the day we buried our oldest son and never fully recovered. I helped her into bed and sat beside her until her breathing slowed, until the tension finally left her shoulders, and she drifted into the kind of sleep that comes from emotional exhaustion rather than rest. I kissed her forehead, the way I had every night for 41 years. Then I rose, quietly closed the bedroom door behind me, and walked down the hallway toward my study. The study was the one room in that modest farmhouse that told the truth about who I was. Not with marble or gold, but with the quiet architecture of real power. 3 monitors on a simple oak desk, a locked cabinet of ledgers that traced back decades, a framed photograph of a young man in dress uniform, smiling the way only the truly fearless smile. I sat down in my chair and let myself look at that photograph for a long moment. Michael had been gone 6 years now, and there were still nights I forgot. Still mornings I nearly called his old cell phone just to hear his voicemail greeting. I had built Ironwood Holdings from nothing, starting with a single warehouse lease when I was 26 years old, fresh out of the service, with nothing but a sharp mind for numbers and a stubborn refusal to ever again feel as powerless as I had felt, watching men under my command die for decisions made by people who never had to bear the consequences. Over 4 decades, I had quietly acquired commercial properties across 3 states, office towers, distribution centers, entire blocks of a city that had no idea who actually held the deeds. I never bought a flashy car. I never wore a suit that cost more than a mortgage payment. I raised my sons to believe their father managed logistics for other people's companies because I did not want them growing up soft entitled, convinced that success was something you inherited rather than something you built with your own 2 hands. With Michael, that plan had worked exactly as I hoped. He'd joined the army at 18 against my quiet worry and Eleanor's tearful pride, and he'd carried himself with a humility that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with character. With Ryan, something had gone differently, though I still could not entirely explain how or why. Perhaps it was the weight of following a brother he could never quite measure up to. Perhaps it was simply the different clay men are made from. Whatever the reason, my younger son had grown into a man who measured his worth by the things other people noticed. And tonight, I had watched exactly what that hunger could do to the woman who raised him. I picked up my secure phone and scrolled to a name I had not called in several months. Sam Whitfield, my lead corporate attorney, and the only man outside this house who knew the full scope of what Ironwood Holdings actually controlled. It rang twice before he picked up his voice, thick with sleep, but immediately alert the moment he recognized my number. "Frank," he said. "It's late. Everything all right?" No, I told him, and I heard him sit up on the other end of the line, the mattress springs creaking faintly. "I need you to do something quietly, and I need it done fast. I need a complete financial picture of my son Ryan, every account, every transaction over the last 6 months. And I need everything you can find on a company called Doyle Capital Ventures. Richard Doyle runs it, my daughter-in-law's father." There was a pause, the particular silence of a good lawyer already calculating implications before asking questions. "What am I looking for specifically?" he asked. "I'm not sure yet," I admitted, and that honesty settled uneasily in my chest. That was rare for me. I usually knew exactly what I was hunting before I ever gave the order to hunt it. Something happened tonight. I can't explain it yet. Just get me the numbers. Sam was quiet for a moment longer than felt comfortable. "Frank," he finally said, his voice careful in the way of a man choosing words meant to prepare rather than alarm. "You know, I'll have this to you within the week. But if your gut is telling you something is wrong, it usually is. Whatever we find, I don't think it's going to be small." I thanked him, ended the call, and sat alone in the dark study for a long while. The glow of the monitors, the only light in the room, Michael's photograph watching over my shoulder, the way it always did. Somewhere down the hallway, Eleanor slept, unaware that her husband had just quietly set in motion a machine that had over the decades dismantled far more powerful men than Richard Doyle ever dreamed of becoming. 3 days passed before Sam called back. 3 days in which I moved through my ordinary life with the practiced calm of a man who had learned decades ago how to carry a storm inside his chest without letting it show on his face. I went to the diner on Route 9 for coffee, with the same men I'd been having coffee with for 20 years. Men who knew me only as Frank, who used to work logistics. Frank, who fixed his own gutters. Frank, who never talked much about money, because as far as they knew, there wasn't much to talk about. Eleanor seemed to recover a little each day, though I noticed she had stopped mentioning Ryan's name at the dinner table, the way a person avoids pressing on a bruise they know is still tender. The call came on a Thursday evening just after 8, while I was standing at the kitchen sink, washing the dinner dishes, because Eleanor had gone up to bed early with a headache. I dried my hands on the towel hanging from the oven handle and answered on the second ring. "You should sit down for this," Sam said, skipping the pleasantries entirely, which told me more than his words did. Sam Whitfield did not skip pleasantries, unless he was standing on the edge of something he considered genuinely dangerous. "I'm sitting," I lied, though I did pull out a chair at the kitchen table and lower myself into it anyway. Some old instinct telling my body to prepare even before my mind understood why. Doyle Capital Ventures. He began as not what it appears to be. On paper, it's a boutique investment firm managing private equity for high net worth clients, mostly people in Richard Doyle's social circle, country club, types people who trust him because he plays golf with their brother-in-law. But the returns he's been paying out Frank, they don't correspond to any actual investment activity my forensic team can find. He's been paying existing investors with money from new investors. It's textbook. It's a Ponzi structure and not a small one. My estimate right now is somewhere between $18 and $22 million in exposure. I felt something settle in my chest, cold and precise. The same feeling I used to get in the field decades ago when a mission briefing revealed the terrain was far more hostile than anyone had prepared for. $22 million was not a man skimming a little off the top to fund a lifestyle. That was a house of cards moments from collapsing, and I now understood with sudden clarity why Richard Doyle had needed his daughter to marry into what he believed was old, quiet money. "And Ryan," I asked, my voice carefully even, "this is where it gets complicated," Sam said, and I could hear paper shuffling on his end of the line. "Your son doesn't appear to have any direct financial stake in Doyle Capital, yet at least not that I can find in 6 months of transaction history. But he has been meeting with Doyle's accountant regularly, and there are wire transfer authorizations in the pipeline that haven't cleared yet. Something is being set up, Frank. I just can't see the full shape of it." I thought about Ryan's face at the party, the way he'd glanced toward us, with something like shame before letting Vanessa's grip on his arm win out. I thought about how a young man convinced he was marrying into wealth might feel the sudden, desperate need to prove he belonged there, to bring something of his own to the table, rather than simply riding on his wife's family name. There's something else. Sam continued his tone, shifting slightly. The careful tone of a lawyer approaching a detail he suspects will matter more than he currently understands. Doyle Capital's headquarters lease the office building downtown, where he runs the whole operation. It's held under a commercial property trust. I ran the ownership chain out of professional habit, Frank, and it traces back to Ironwood Holdings. I sat very still for a moment, feeling the strange vertigo of 2 separate worlds I had spent decades keeping apart, suddenly unexpectedly touching. "I own that building," I said, more to myself than to him. "You own that building," Sam confirmed. "Which means, if it ever comes to it, you have direct leverage over Richard Doyle's physical operation that he has absolutely no idea exists. He thinks his landlord is a faceless commercial trust managed by a property firm in Philadelphia. He has no idea the trust answers directly to you. I let that information settle, turning it over. The way I might turn over an unfamiliar tool, testing its weight, its edges, its possible uses. I have never believed in coincidence. Not really. Not after 40 years of building something out of nothing, through patience and precision, rather than luck. But there was something almost merciful about this particular alignment of circumstance, as though the universe had, without my asking, handed me a door that led directly into the heart of a man who did not yet know I existed. "Keep digging," I told Sam. Quietly, "I want to know exactly what Ryan is planning before he finishes planning it." I ended the call and sat alone at the kitchen table for a long while. The hum of the refrigerator, the only sound in the house. Upstairs, Eleanor slept unaware that the modest, unremarkable life she believed she still lived was standing at the edge of something far larger than either of us had anticipated 3 nights ago on that drive home from the Doyle estate. I did not yet know the full shape of what my son was building for himself, but I had learned enough after 4 decades in business to recognize the early architecture of a very serious mistake. The following Tuesday brought a hard rain that rattled against the study windows, while I reviewed quarterly reports from 3 of my regional property managers, the ordinary business of running an empire nobody knew I ran. Sam called just after noon, his voice carrying the particular energy of a man who has found exactly what he was looking for. "I think I understand the shape of it now," he said, without preamble. Ryan isn't just watching Doyle Capital from the sidelines anymore. There's a wire authorization sitting in draft status, $400,000, moving from an account under Ryan's name into Doyle Capital's primary operating fund. It hasn't executed yet, but it's loaded and ready to fire the moment he has the capital to back it. $400,000 was a number that made no sense against anything I knew of my son's finances. Ryan worked as a regional sales manager for a mid-sized medical supply company, a respectable job, a comfortable salary, nothing close to the kind of liquid capital Sam was describing. Where would he get that kind of money? I asked, though. Some cold part of me already suspected the answer before I finished the question. "That's what I can't determine. Yet," Sam admitted. "It's not coming from any account I can currently trace to him directly. Whatever the source is, it's routed through something I haven't identified. Give me a few more days." I thanked him and ended the call, then sat for a long moment staring out at the rain sheeting down the study window, an old unease growing heavier in my chest. With every passing second, the specific unease of a man who suspects the answer to a question, but does not yet want to know he suspects it. 400 miles away in an entirely different kind of afternoon, Ryan sat across from Vanessa at a rooftop restaurant overlooking the city skyline, the 2 of them sharing a bottle of wine that cost more than most people's weekly grocery bill. Vanessa was scrolling through wedding photos on her phone from a friend's recent engagement party, occasionally holding the screen up for Ryan to admire a dress or a floral arrangement, and Ryan nodded along with the particular attentiveness of a man determined to prove he belonged at that table. "My father says the Q4 numbers are finally turning around," Vanessa said, setting her phone down and reaching for her wine glass. "He mentioned bringing on a strategic partner soon, someone who understands the industry and can help stabilize the fund during the transition. Someone with real capital behind them." Ryan's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a subtle straightening of his shoulders, the posture of a man hearing an opportunity announce itself. He had spent the better part of a year feeling like the least impressive person in every room he entered with the Doyles, the son-in-law who managed regional sales territories, while his father-in-law managed millions. He had watched Richard Doyle's associates talk about hedge positions and leveraged buyouts with an easy confidence Ryan had never once possessed, and he had grown tired, deeply tired, of being the quiet one at the table, who nodded along without contributing. "I might be in a position to help with that," Ryan said, carefully watching Vanessa's face for a reaction. She looked up at him with genuine surprise, the kind of attention Ryan had been quietly starving for since the day he married into that family. "You never mentioned having capital like that," she said. "There are things about my family you don't fully understand yet," Ryan replied. And there was something almost thrilling in the vagueness of the statement, the way it let him imply depths that did not actually exist. "My father has been sitting on land and property for decades. There's more there than people realize." Vanessa's expression warmed considerably, and for a moment, Ryan felt something he had been chasing for months, without quite naming it the specific satisfaction of being looked at the way his father-in-law's associates were looked at, with interest rather than tolerance. "If you could help my father through this rough patch," she said, leaning forward slightly, "it would mean everything to this family." To us. Ryan smiled and refilled her wine glass, already turning over in his mind the conversation he would need to have with his mother about the farm's insurance paperwork, already constructing, without fully allowing himself to name it. As such, the justification he would use to explain why the timing needed to be soon, why it needed to happen quietly, why it was simply easier if she didn't ask too many questions about documents she trusted him completely to handle. Back in the farmhouse study, I closed the folder Sam had sent and rubbed my eyes, feeling the particular exhaustion of a man circling closer to a truth his body understood before his mind was ready to accept it. I did not yet know that 400 miles away, over wine and skyline views, my son was already deciding exactly how he intended to raise the capital he had just promised. I only knew that something in this story involved money my family did not actually have, and men who never explain where sudden capital comes from are rarely explaining it, because the answer is something they are proud of. I spent the better part of that Wednesday morning in the small office I kept above the hardware store in town, the one with my name on the lease. Callahan Logistics Consulting, a business that existed mostly on paper and served as a convenient explanation for why I disappeared for hours at a time without anyone in Millbrook asking too many questions. It was there, away from the farmhouse, away from Eleanor's watchful attention, that I did the parts of my real work that required silence and concentration. I pulled the full commercial lease file on the downtown office building housing Doyle Capital Ventures, the physical document Sam had only summarized over the phone. Ironwood Holdings had acquired the property 9 years earlier through a subsidiary trust, one of dozens scattered across my portfolio, each one deliberately structured so that no single filing anywhere connected the name Frank Callahan to anything larger than a modest logistics consultant with a farmhouse and an unremarkable sedan. I traced the chain of ownership myself, line by line, the way I had trained myself to do decades ago, rather than trusting any single set of eyes but my own when something mattered this much. There it was buried in Section 14 of a lease agreement most tenants never read. Past the rent schedule, a standard commercial default clause, but written with a precision I recognized instantly as my own legal team's language from years back. Any material breach of financial disclosure requirements, any indication of fraudulent business practice discovered by the landlord or its agents, triggered an immediate right of lockout and asset lien against contents of the leased premises. I had insisted on that clause across every commercial property in my portfolio after watching a tenant in one of my Philadelphia buildings run an insurance fraud scheme for 18 months before authorities caught up with him, costing my trust considerable legal exposure in the process. I had built that protection to guard my own interests. I had never imagined I would one day consider using it as a weapon against my own son's father-in-law. I sat with that clause for a long while, the fluorescent light above my desk humming faintly, the hardware store below occasionally sending up the muffled sound of a customer's boots on the old wooden floor. Having the leverage was one thing. Understanding exactly how to use it, and exactly when required patience, I was not certain I currently possessed. I called Sam again in the early afternoon, this time from my office, rather than the farmhouse, a habit I maintained out of old discipline more than any real fear of being overheard. I found the lockout clause, I told him. If Doyle Capital's fraud can be documented and reported to the appropriate authorities, I have the contractual right to seize the physical premises and freeze operations immediately. No court order required for the initial lockout given the language we wrote into that agreement. Sam exhaled slowly on the other end of the line. "That's a serious weapon, Frank. Using it means everyone connected to that fraud gets exposed at the same time, including anyone who's already tied their name to Doyle Capital's transactions. If Ryan executes that wire transfer, we found if his name ends up on Doyle's books in any official capacity, he goes down with the rest of it. There's no way to isolate him from the fallout once that lockout triggers." I know I said, and the words felt heavier leaving my mouth than I expected them to. "I know exactly what that means, Sam. Then we need to know precisely what Ryan's involvement actually is before you decide anything." Sam said, his voice careful now, the tone of a man who had known me long enough to recognize when I was standing at the edge of a decision that would not be easily undone. "Where is that $400,000 coming from? Until we know that you're aiming a weapon in the dark." I agreed, though, something in my chest already understood, with the particular clarity that comes from 40 years of watching human beings make predictable mistakes, that whatever explanation eventually surfaced would not be one I wanted to hear. I ended the call and sat alone in that small office for a long time, staring at the framed photograph on my desk of Eleanor and me on our wedding day 41 years and a lifetime of careful discretion ago, back when the biggest secret we shared was simply how much we loved each other and how little either of us cared about the money neither of us had yet earned. I thought of the farm that evening as I drove home, the fields turning gold in the last light of October, the old barn where Michael used to help me split wood every autumn before dinner. I thought of the small metal box in the study safe that held his folded flag. His medal's the last letter he ever wrote us before the mission that took him. I did not yet know that somewhere in the space between that farm and my son's ambitions, a document existed that would connect those two worlds in a way I could never have prepared myself for. To understand what happened next, I need to take you back 6 weeks earlier than that October rain, back to a gray morning in September that Eleanor and I still mark every year, whether we want to or not. It is the anniversary of the day. 2 soldiers in dress uniforms walked up our gravel driveway, and Eleanor knew before they ever reached the porch, the way mothers sometimes simply know. We hold a quiet ceremony out at the farm each year. On that date, nothing elaborate, just the 2 of us. Occasionally Ryan, when he remembered to come walking out to the small memorial stone we placed at the edge of the north field, the same field where Michael used to help me bale hay every summer of his childhood. We had scattered a portion of his ashes there at his own written request in the letter he left with his unit before deployment. A letter that asked to be buried somewhere he could still hear the tractor running and the creek moving through the property line. That particular September morning, Eleanor had woken early, and I found her already dressed and sitting at the kitchen table still in her nightgown, beneath her coat, staring at nothing in particular. Grief settles differently into a person with each passing year, not lighter exactly, but quieter until certain mornings crack it back open without warning. That was one of those mornings for her. Ryan arrived around 10, which surprised me, given how often other obligations had kept him away in recent years. He hugged his mother longer than usual, and I remember feeling a small, foolish flicker of gratitude that my younger son had chosen to show up, had chosen for once to put family before the endless demands of his new life with the Doyles. We walked out to the north field together, the 3 of us, and stood in silence while the wind moved through the tall grass the way it always did that time of year. Eleanor was not herself that day. The sedative her doctor had prescribed years ago for the anniversary, the one she rarely needed anymore, she had taken that morning after a difficult, sleepless night, and it left her soft around the edges, her thoughts slower than usual, her guard, which had never been particularly high to begin with, entirely absent. I did not think anything of this at the time. I had simply been grateful she had slept at all. It was sometime after we returned to the house while I was in the barn, checking on a tractor that had been giving me trouble, that Ryan sat with his mother at the kitchen table and produced a folder of documents. He told her gently that he had been meaning to help with some paperwork insurance updates for the farm. He said standard forms the county required after a certain number of years. Nothing she needed to worry about reading in detail since he had already reviewed everything himself. I was not in that room. I want to be honest about that because I have spent many long nights since turning over every version of what I might have done differently had I simply come inside 10 minutes earlier. Eleanor has told me since, in the halting way, a person describes something that shames them. Though the shame was never rightfully hers to carry, that Ryan sat close beside her, that he held her hand the way he used to as a boy, needing comfort, that he told her not to worry about the fine print because her eyes were tired and he had already made sure everything was correct. She trusted him. Of course she trusted him. He was her son. And a mother who has already buried one child does not easily imagine the one still living capable of causing her harm. She signed where he pointed, page after page, her signature growing slightly less steady with each one, though neither of them seemed to notice, or if Ryan noticed, he said nothing that would have given her pause. I came in from the barn sometime later to find them sitting quietly together, Ryan's arm around his mother's shoulders, the folder already tucked away in his bag. "Everything all right in here?" I asked, and Ryan smiled at me, that same easy smile he had given Vanessa outside the party weeks later, and told me he had just been helping his mother with some paperwork, so I wouldn't have to worry about it. I thanked him. I actually thanked my own son, grateful in that moment that he had taken something off Eleanor's plate during a day already heavy enough, without added burden. I had no reason then to imagine what those pages actually contained. No reason to suspect that the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle in that very driveway had just walked his medicated grieving mother through signing away a piece of the ground where his own brother's ashes rested. We had dinner together that evening, the four of us, including Vanessa, who arrived later, and it was by any outward measure a peaceful, ordinary family evening. It was only weeks later, sitting in my study with Sam's reports spread across the desk, that I would understand what I had actually thanked my son for that afternoon. And by then the paperwork was already filed, the transfer already recorded, and the ground beneath my wife's feet quite literally no longer entirely hers to stand on. Eleanor told me the rest of it herself much later, on a night when the truth had already broken over both of us, and there was nothing left to protect her from by staying silent. I share it now the way she shared it with me, haltingly in pieces, because I believe understanding exactly what was taken from her matters more than any legal document ever could. She said Ryan had waited until I was out at the barn, which she did not think strange at the time, since I was often out at the barn. And since Ryan had always been the son who preferred talking to his mother alone rather than in front of me, a habit that went back to his boyhood, when he would ask her permission for things he suspected I might refuse. He had set the folder on the table between them and told her the county required updated documentation for the farm's insurance every few years, something about liability coverage, now that the property had appreciated in value. He said he had already gone through everything with an agent and just needed her signature in a few places, so I wouldn't have to be bothered with it during a difficult week. She remembers feeling grateful. That detail has stayed with me more than any other, the fact that in the very moment her son was deceiving her, she felt a small rush of maternal pride that he had grown into a man capable of handling adult responsibilities, capable of protecting his aging parents from unnecessary paperwork. She remembers her vision swimming slightly from the medication, the words on the page blurring at the edges, no matter how many times she blinked to focus them. He held her hand while she signed. She told me the same hand he used to hold crossing the road as a small boy. He pointed to each dotted line, with a gentleness she mistook entirely for care. She asked him once, she said whether she needed to read through it more carefully, and he told her not to worry, that he had read every word twice already, and there was nothing in there that wasn't standard. Nothing that would surprise her later. She signed 6 pages that afternoon. She does not remember the exact wording of any of them, only the weight of the pen in her hand, and the warm, secure feeling of being cared for by her own child during a day that had already asked so much of her. When she finished, Ryan slid the folder back into his bag and kissed the top of her head the way he had as a young man, before leaving for college, and told her she was the best mother anyone could ask for. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to tell this part of the story with more anger than truth allows. Ryan did not hold a knife to his mother's throat. He did not force her hand across the page. What he did was quieter, and in some ways far more difficult to forgive, because it required him to look directly into the trusting eyes of a grieving woman and calculate with cold precision exactly how much of her guard the medication and the sorrow of that particular day had already worn away. He understood his mother's love for him well enough to know she would never think to question it, and he used that understanding as a tool, the same way another man might use a crowbar or a set of lockpicks. What those pages actually authorized, as I would learn weeks later from Sam's careful reading of the county filings, was a durable power of attorney, granting Ryan broad legal authority over specific portions of Eleanor's property holdings, including her half-interest in the farm we had owned together for 37 years. The same farm that held the Northfield. The same field that held our son. Eleanor did not know in the days and weeks that followed that anything unusual had occurred. She went about her ordinary life, tending her garden before the first frost, calling her sister on Sunday afternoons, worrying gently about whether Ryan and Vanessa were eating well, entirely unaware that somewhere in a county records office, a transfer had already been quietly filed, moving legal control of a portion of her own land into the hands of the son she trusted more completely than she had ever trusted anyone outside of me. It was not until I sat in my study, weeks later, cross-referencing property records against Sam's financial reports, that the full shape of that September afternoon finally revealed itself to me. And I understood with a grief that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with betrayal exactly what my son had done to his own grieving mother, while I stood 40 yards away in a barn, oblivious, thanking him for his help. Sam's follow-up call came on a Friday afternoon, and this time there was no preamble at all, no careful easing into difficult information. I found the filing, he said, his voice tight, in a way I had rarely heard from him in 15 years of working together. "Frank, I need you to pull up the county register of deeds right now while I'm on the phone with you. I'm sending you the document number." I opened my laptop at the kitchen table. Eleanor upstairs napping through a quiet Friday afternoon, the house settled into the particular stillness that farmhouses take on in October, when the fields have already been cut, and the light starts going gold too early in the day. I typed in the number Sam sent and watched the county's property record system load a scanned document onto my screen. It was a durable power of attorney, executed and notarized, granting Ryan Michael Callahan broad legal authority over specific portions of Eleanor Grace Callahan's real property holdings. I read the document twice before the date at the top of the page fully registered in my mind. And when it did, something in my chest seemed to drop straight through the floor of that kitchen and keep falling. The document was dated September 14th, the anniversary of Michael's memorial service. The day I had stood in the barn fighting with a tractor engine while my son sat at our kitchen table and walked his medicated grieving wife through 6 pages of paperwork that would strip away legal control of a piece of land holding our other son's ashes. I sat very still for a long moment, the laptop screen glowing in front of me, Sam's voice still coming through the phone, though I had stopped fully processing his words. "Frank," he was saying, "are you still there?" "I'm here." I managed, though my own voice sounded distant to me, the voice of a man speaking from somewhere outside his own body. "Sam, that's the day we visit Michael's memorial. That's the day Eleanor takes her sedative because she can't sleep the night before." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, the particular silence of a man who has just understood the full moral weight of the numbers he's been tracking. "I didn't know," that Sam said quietly. "Frank, I'm so sorry." I closed the laptop slowly, as though closing it gently might somehow undo what I had just read, and pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes for a moment, willing myself back into the cold, clear thinking that had carried me through 4 decades of difficult decisions. Anger would not serve me here. Anger never served anyone in a fight that required precision rather than force. And I understood even in that first raw moment of grief that whatever came next demanded exactly the kind of clarity I had spent my whole life training myself to hold on to under pressure. What did he do with it? I asked, my voice steadier now. What did the power of attorney actually authorize him to execute? "I need another day to trace the full chain," Sam said, "but I can tell you what I've found so far. 3 weeks ago, a title transfer was filed on a portion of your property, specifically the northern acreage, moving partial ownership into a holding entity registered to Richard Doyle. The transfer used Ryan's authority under that power of attorney as the legal basis for Eleanor's signature not being required directly." I looked out the kitchen window toward the north field, visible in the distance beyond the old fence line, the small gray shape of Michael's memorial stone, just barely catching the afternoon light. I had walked that field 1,000 times since burying a portion of my son's ashes there. I had never once imagined I would need to defend it from my other son. "There's more," Sam continued, and I could hear the reluctance in his voice, the tone of a man delivering information he wished he did not have to deliver. "That transfer wasn't a gift, Frank. It was used as collateral. Vincent Sari, Richard Doyle secured a substantial loan against that acreage, and based on the loan documents I'm looking at, there's a cross-collateralization clause. If Doyle defaults on that loan for any reason, the bank has the legal right to seize additional collateral, and Frank, the additional collateral listed is the remaining acreage of your farm. All of it." I sat in that kitchen for a long time after the call ended, the light shifting slowly across the floor as the afternoon wore toward evening. Eleanor still sleeping upstairs, unaware that the ground beneath our entire life together now sat balanced on the financial fate of a man neither of us had chosen, secured by a signature she had given in good faith on the one day of the year she was least equipped to understand what she was signing. I did not sleep that night. I lay beside Eleanor in the dark, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing, and turned the problem over in my mind, the way I might have once studied a battlefield map, searching for the option that minimized casualties rather than the option that felt most satisfying in the moment. By 4 a.m, I had given up on rest entirely and gone down to the study, where I sat in the dark with nothing but Michael's photograph and the quiet tick of the old grandfather clock in the hallway for company. The simplest path forward sat right in front of me, and I want to be honest about how strongly it tempted me. I could call Sam in the morning and instruct him to file an emergency fraud complaint, immediately citing the power of attorney's fraudulent execution, citing Eleanor's medicated and non-consenting state at the time of signing. Such a complaint would trigger an automatic legal freeze on the transfer void the collateral arrangement, and restore full ownership of the northern acreage within days rather than weeks. It was the fastest way to protect the land. It was also, I understood clearly, even in that raw early morning hour, the fastest way to guarantee my son spent the next decade of his life in a federal prison. Elder financial fraud carried mandatory sentencing guidelines that showed no mercy for family relationships. If I filed that complaint the moment investigators traced the forged authority back to Ryan's specific actions in obtaining it, and Sam assured me they inevitably would, Ryan would be looking at a felony conviction with a minimum sentence measured in years, not months. His marriage would end. His career would end. Whatever version of my son still existed beneath the ambition and the poor judgment would spend the better part of his 30s inside a concrete cell. I thought about the boy who used to fall asleep in the truck on the drive home from Little League practice, small enough then that I would carry him inside without waking him. I thought about the awkward, uncertain teenager who stood at his brother's memorial service, unable to find words adequate to the moment. And I wondered, not for the first time since Michael's death, whether some of what had gone wrong in Ryan since then traced back to years of quietly believing he would never measure up to a brother who had died a hero, years of searching for some other arena wealth status, the approval of men like Richard Doyle, where he might finally feel like enough. None of that excused what he had done. I want to be clear about that, both to myself in that dark study and to anyone hearing this story now. Understanding the roots of a man's failure does not erase his responsibility for the harm that failure causes. Ryan was 32 years old, a grown man fully capable of choosing honesty over deception, fully capable of asking his father for help, rather than manipulating his medicated mother behind his father's back. Whatever wound had shaped him, he alone had chosen how to carry it forward into the world, and he had chosen, when it mattered most, to carry it forward as a weapon against the two people who had given him everything. I thought about calling the bank directly using my own financial weight to quietly buy out Doyle's loan before it ever came to collateral seizure protecting the farm, without anyone outside this study ever needing to know what Ryan had done. It would have been easy. I had the capital sitting in liquid accounts to make that loan disappear before lunch the following day. But some old, hard part of me, the part shaped by 4 decades of watching what happens when consequences are quietly absorbed by people with enough money to absorb them, refused to let Ryan simply walk away from this untouched, believing his mother's trust was a resource he could spend without ever accounting for the cost. By the time the first gray light of dawn began creeping through the study window, I had arrived at the decision that would define the following weeks. I would not file the fraud complaint immediately. I would not quietly buy Ryan's way out of the consequences he had built for himself. I would instead let the structure he and Richard Doyle had constructed run its natural course a while longer, gathering every piece of evidence Sam could assemble until the moment came when I could dismantle the entire arrangement, Doyle's fraud and Ryan's betrayal, both in a single decisive stroke that would leave no ambiguity about what had happened or why. It was not vengeance I was choosing, though I understood how easily it might look that way from the outside. It was something closer to what the Army had taught me decades earlier about the difference between a reaction and a strategy. The understanding that the man who strikes first in anger rarely strikes with precision, while the man who waits, who gathers every advantage before he moves, rarely needs to strike more than once. I closed my eyes and allowed myself, for just a moment, to grieve the son I thought I had raised. Then I stood, poured a cup of coffee, and went to find Sam's number in my phone, ready to tell him exactly how patient I intended to be, and exactly what I would need him to build in the meantime. The knock came on a Sunday afternoon 3 days after my decision, confident and unhurried the knock of someone who had never once in his life doubted his welcome. I opened the door to find Ryan and Vanessa standing on the porch, Ryan in a blazer that looked slightly too polished for a casual family visit. Vanessa in sunglasses, despite the overcast sky already glancing past me into the house, with the faint distaste of someone checking whether the furniture had improved since her last visit. "Dad," Ryan said, stepping past me into the front hall without waiting to be invited. "Is Mom around?" "We have some news." Eleanor came in from the kitchen wiping her hands on a dish towel, and I watched her face brighten the particular way it always did, at the sight of her son, an openness that 3 weeks of silent investigation had done nothing to diminish in her, since she still knew nothing of what those documents contained. I felt the familiar tightness rise in my chest at the sight of that unguarded joy, knowing what I now knew, and forced it back down beneath the calm I had spent decades perfecting. We sat in the living room, Vanessa perched on the edge of the good armchair, as though the fabric might transfer something unpleasant onto her clothing, while Ryan remained standing near the fireplace, one hand in his pocket, radiating the particular energy of a man who has been waiting all week for an audience worthy of his announcement. "Richard's bringing me on as a senior partner," Ryan said, unable to keep the pride from his voice. "Not just an associate position, a real partnership stake in Doyle Capital. Equity, decision-making authority, all of it. He said he's never seen anyone learn the business as fast as I have." Eleanor clapped her hands together, delighted in the uncomplicated way a mother is delighted by any success her child reports to her. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," she said. "Your father and I are so proud of you." I said nothing for a moment, watching my son's face, searching it for any flicker of the boy who used to ask permission before making decisions, any trace of hesitation about how such rapid advancement might have been purchased. I found none. Whatever guilt Ryan carried about the farm, about his mother's shaking signature on those 6 pages, he had buried it somewhere deep enough that it no longer troubled the surface of his self-satisfaction. "You know?" Ryan continued warming to his subject, now glancing toward me with something that might have once been an attempt to impress and had curdled over the years into something closer to condescension. "It's strange, Dad. I used to think working in logistics for other companies, your whole career meant you just never had the ambition to build something bigger. But now that I'm actually inside real finance, seeing how partnerships and capital actually work, I understand it differently. Some men just aren't built for that level of risk. There's nothing wrong with that. Takes all kinds." Vanessa smiled faintly at this, adjusting her sunglasses, and I understood in that moment that this visit was not truly about sharing good news with his parents. It was about something closer to a performance, an opportunity for Ryan to stand in the living room of the modest farmhouse he had grown up embarrassed by and demonstrate for an audience that included his wife exactly how far he believed he had surpassed the father who raised him. I could have told him everything in that moment. I want to be honest that the temptation existed sharp and immediate to watch that smug certainty drain from his face the instant I revealed what I actually controlled, what I actually knew about Doyle Capital's true financial condition, about the building his precious partnership operated out of about the 6 pages his medicated mother had signed on the anniversary of his brother's death. I could have ended his triumphant little speech with a single sentence. Instead, I simply smiled, the same mild, unremarkable smile I had worn for 4 decades, while men far more dangerous than Ryan underestimated me across boardroom tables and negotiation rooms, and said quietly, "Good luck with your new partner." Something in my tone must have registered, because Ryan's easy confidence flickered for just a moment, a brief crack in the performance, though he clearly could not identify its source. He studied my face for a beat too long, the way a man studies a door he suddenly suspects might be locked before Vanessa checked her phone and announced they needed to leave for a dinner reservation, and the moment passed. I walked them to the door and watched their car pull out of the driveway, Eleanor waving happily from the porch beside me, entirely unaware of everything I now carried silently on her behalf. I thought of Sam's warning weeks earlier about aiming a weapon in the dark, and understood watching my son's taillights disappear down the road that the darkness was very nearly finished. Whatever happened next would happen in full light, and Ryan, for all his newfound confidence, had no idea how quickly that light was coming for him. I had no way of knowing it. Then, standing on that porch, watching their tail lights disappear. But the tremors I sensed, shifting beneath my son's feet, had already reached someone else entirely. Someone who had far more reason than I did to notice a crack before it became a collapse. Vanessa noticed it first in small things, the way her father's assistant had started speaking to him in hushed, clipped tones whenever Vanessa happened to be in the office, the way 3 of his oldest golf partners had stopped returning his calls over the past month. She had grown up watching Richard Doyle command rooms with an ease that seemed almost hereditary. A birthright passed down through generations of men who never doubted their own importance. And the small cracks now showing in that confidence unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. She raised it with him one evening, catching him alone in his study with 2 fingers of scotch and a laptop screen full of spreadsheets. He closed a little too quickly when she walked in. "Is everything all right with the fund?" she asked, settling into the leather chair across from his desk, the way she had as a teenager, back when this study had felt like the safest room in the world, rather than a place where secrets accumulated in the walls. Richard's smile arrived a half-second too late, the practiced warmth of a man buying himself time to construct an answer. "Just a rough quarter, sweetheart," he said. "Markets are difficult right now, nothing to worry about." She wanted to believe him. She had spent her entire life believing him, had built her sense of her own worth on the foundation of being Richard Doyle's daughter, the girl whose family occupied the best table at every restaurant, whose name opened doors before she had done anything to earn the opening. But something in his eyes that evening reminded her uncomfortably of the way Ryan's face had looked lately too. A specific kind of strain that people carry when they are working very hard to keep something from collapsing in front of an audience. "You've been asking Ryan for money," she said, not quite a question, watching her father's expression carefully. "I saw the wire authorization on your desk last week. $400,000, Dad. Where's Ryan even getting that kind of money?" Richard set down his glass with more force than the gesture required. "That's between me and my new partner," he said, an edge creeping into his voice that she had rarely heard directed at her before. "You don't need to worry about the business side of things, Vanessa. Just enjoy your marriage." The dismissal stung more than she expected, and she left the study that night with a small, cold seed of doubt planted somewhere she had never allowed doubt to grow before. She found herself over the following days paying closer attention to details she had always simply accepted without examination. The way Richard's assistant flinched slightly whenever a particular law firm called the way her father had started taking meetings in restaurants rather than his own office, as though he no longer entirely trusted the walls of his own company. She mentioned none of this to Ryan directly, partly because she was not yet certain what she was seeing, and partly because some instinct she did not fully understand told her that voicing the suspicion aloud might make it more real than she was prepared for. Instead, she watched the way she imagined her father had taught her to watch, without ever intending the lesson cataloging small inconsistencies, the way a person catalogs symptoms before they are ready to accept a diagnosis. The night before Ryan and Vanessa's celebratory dinner at the private club, she lay awake beside her husband, listening to his steady breathing, and found herself thinking unbidden of Ryan's. In-laws, the quiet farmhouse she had visited only a handful of times, the mother-in-law she had once dismissed so casually as unremarkable. She thought of the strange, unreadable calm on Frank Callahan's face the last time they had visited, the way he had wished Ryan luck with his new partner in a tone that had not in retrospect sounded entirely like a blessing. She almost said something to Ryan that night, some vague articulation of the unease coiling in her chest. But he had fallen asleep, already exhausted from the excitement of his impending promotion, and she told herself the feeling would pass by morning, the way most anxieties do when examined in daylight. She did not yet understand that the unease she felt was not paranoia, but instinct. The same instinct her father had spent 30 years teaching her to trust in every other context except, apparently, the one where it might have actually protected her. By the time the celebratory dinner arrived the following evening, whatever quiet alarm she had felt in her father's study had been buried beneath champagne and toasts, and the particular giddiness of watching her husband finally seemed to belong at the table she had always occupied. She did not yet know how quickly that belonging would dissolve, how completely the ground beneath both the men in her life was about to give way, or how much of what came next she would need to face entirely alone. I want to go back for a moment to something that happened just before Ryan and Vanessa left that afternoon, a detail I did not include in its proper place because I needed to sit with it privately before I could tell it the way it deserves to be told. As Vanessa gathered her purse from the armchair and moved toward the door, Ryan lingered a moment longer in the living room, and something in his expression shifted, the easy performance dropping away, just slightly replaced by something sharper, almost cruel. "You know, Dad," he said. His voice lower now meant only for me, not for his mother, who had already stepped onto the porch to say goodbye to Vanessa. I used to feel bad about how small our life was growing up. The used cars, this house. Kids at school used to ask why we never went anywhere for vacation. But I get it now. Some men just accept being ordinary. Richard built something real. He took risks. He's not scared of being somebody. I stood very still, feeling the words land exactly where he intended them to land, in that old, tender place every father carries, where his child's disappointment in him lives, regardless of how much armor the years have built around it. I thought of the 26-year-old version of myself who had come home from war with nothing but discipline and a stubborn refusal to ever again feel powerless, who had built an empire brick by brick, specifically so that his sons would never know the particular fear of watching other men make decisions that governed their survival. I thought of how carefully I had hidden that empire precisely, so my boys would learn to build their own worth rather than lean on mine, and how completely that intention had backfired in the son standing in front of me now. "I'm not scared of anything, Ryan," I said quietly, and I meant it more literally than he could possibly have understood in that moment. I've just never needed the whole world to know what I'm capable of in order to feel it myself. Something flickered across his face. Confusion, perhaps, or the faint discomfort of a man who senses he has misjudged an opponent, but cannot yet say why. "That's very poetic, Dad," he said, recovering his smirk. "But some of us actually want more out of life than a quiet farm and a consulting business nobody's ever heard of." I nodded slowly, and I want to be honest that in that moment, something in me, some final thread of hope, that had survived even the discovery of the forged power of attorney, quietly finally broke. Not the hope that Ryan would somehow escape consequences. I had already accepted weeks earlier that consequences were coming regardless. It was the hope that some version of the boy who used to run to me crying when he skinned his knee still existed beneath the ambition that whatever came next might still leave enough of him intact to eventually understand what he had done and grieve it properly. "I hope Richard's partnership gives you everything you're looking for," I told him, and my voice carried none of the anger boiling quietly beneath it, only a strange, weary gentleness that seemed to unsettle him more than fury would have. "I wish you good luck with your new partner," I said, again silently to myself, in the private language of my own resolve. Though aloud I simply repeated, "Good luck with your new partner, son." He studied me for a long moment, and for just a fraction of a second, I saw something almost like fear pass behind his eyes, quickly suppressed, quickly buried beneath the confidence he had built his entire new identity around. Whatever instinct warned him in that moment, he chose, as he had chosen so many times before, to override it rather than examine it. "Thanks, Dad," he said, already turning toward the door where Vanessa was waiting. "We'll see you guys soon." I watched him walk down the porch steps toward the car, his shoulders squared with the particular confidence of a man who believes he has just won an argument he does not realize was never actually about winning. Eleanor waved from beside me, calling out that she loved them, and Vanessa offered a thin, distracted smile in return before sliding into the passenger seat. I stood on that porch until their car disappeared around the bend in the road, and only then did I allow the weight I had been holding all afternoon to finally settle fully into my chest. That was the last time my son stood in that house, believing himself untouchable. I did not know it yet with certainty, but some old soldier's instinct in me understood that the ground had already shifted beneath his feet, even if the tremors had not yet reached the surface where he could feel them. Richard Doyle arrived at his downtown office that Tuesday morning in an unusually good mood, humming along to the classical station on his car radio, already mentally rehearsing the conversation he intended to have with Ryan about accelerating the partnership paperwork. The $400,000 wire transfer had finally executed the day before, a fact that had settled something anxious in his chest that had been keeping him awake for weeks. With that capital now sitting in his operating account, he could finally cover the redemption requests that had been piling up from 3 of his oldest investors. Buying himself, he believed another 6 months of breathing room before he needed to find the next infusion. He parked in his reserved spot beneath the building, straightened his tie in the rearview mirror, and walked into the lobby with the easy confidence of a man who had spent 30 years believing the world generally arranged itself in his favor. The elevator ride to the 14th floor felt shorter than usual, colored by the particular lightness of a man who has just convinced himself his problems are behind him. The trouble announced itself the moment the elevator doors opened. 2 uniformed federal marshals stood in the reception area alongside a private security team in dark polo shirts, and behind them, a technician was already affixing a printed notice to the frosted glass doors of Doyle Capital Ventures. Richard's stomach dropped before his mind had fully processed what he was seeing, some old animal instinct, recognizing danger before conscious thought could catch up. "Mr. Doyle," one of the marshals said, stepping forward with the flat, procedural calm of a man who had delivered this particular kind of news many times before we have a court order and a landlord's default notice requiring the immediate lockout of these premises. Effective as of 9 o'clock this morning, your access to this office and all contents within has been revoked. Richard stood frozen for a moment, his briefcase still in hand, watching through the glass, as his own employees were being escorted from their desks, personal belongings hastily gathered into cardboard boxes, computer terminals already dark. "This is insane," he said, his voice climbing toward the register of a man realizing his authority meant nothing in this particular room. "I am the CEO of this company. Whose order is this? On what grounds?" The marshal handed him a thick document, and Richard's eyes caught the words, "fraudulent business practices" and "material breach of lease agreement," before his vision seemed to blur at the edges. "The landlord," the marshal explained, invoking a specific right of lockout embedded in your commercial lease, following documentation of financial irregularities, has exercised immediate repossession of the premises. Everything inside remains under seizure, pending federal investigation. What landlord Richard demanded, though, even as he asked the question, a cold unease was already spreading through him, the recognition that he had never once in 9 years of leasing that office actually met the person or entity that owned the building. He had dealt exclusively with a property management company, a faceless administrative buffer he had never bothered to question, precisely because the rent checks always cleared, and the building's owner had never once, until this exact moment, made their presence felt. The lease is held under a trust managed by Ironwood Holdings, the marshal said, checking his clipboard, though the name meant nothing to Richard, who had never heard of Frank Callahan, and certainly never imagined that the quiet, unremarkable father of his son-in-law controlled the very ground beneath the office, where he had spent 9 years building an empire made almost entirely of borrowed money and false promises. Richard called his chief financial officer from the sidewalk outside the building, his voice climbing steadily toward panic, as the man on the other end confirmed that the emergency freeze extended beyond the physical office, that Doyle Capital's primary operating accounts had also been flagged and frozen pending the fraud investigation triggered by the same filing. Every dollar Richard believed he had access to, including the $400,000 he had received from Ryan only the day before, had become in the span of a single morning entirely inaccessible. He stood on that sidewalk for a long time after ending the call, watching security guards carry the last of his personal effects out to the curb, his reflection ghostly in the darkened glass doors that no longer opened for him. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a small, cold voice was already calculating who he might need to blame, who might need to absorb the weight of what was clearly about to become a very public collapse, and the name that surfaced first, with an ease that would have disturbed him had he paused to examine it, was Ryan. Ryan and Vanessa were 3 hours into a celebratory dinner at a private club overlooking the river, a table Richard had reserved weeks earlier to mark what he called the official start of Ryan's new chapter when the trouble found them. Ryan had just ordered a second bottle of wine, still riding the high of a partnership announcement he had made to 2 of his old college friends that afternoon, embellishing the details slightly, allowing them to believe the equity stake was already fully executed rather than still pending final paperwork. His phone buzzed against the white tablecloth, and he glanced down to see a notification from his bank. A routine-looking alert he almost dismissed until he read the words, "Declined transaction," and felt something cold move through his chest. He tried the card again at the bar a moment later, ordering a round of drinks he did not particularly want, purely to test whether the first decline had been an error. The second decline came back within seconds. He excused himself from the table and stepped into the hallway outside the dining room, dialing Vincent's number with hands that had begun almost imperceptibly to shake. The call went to voicemail. He tried again. Voicemail a second time. On the third attempt, Richard finally answered, and the voice that greeted Ryan bore no resemblance to the confident, avuncular tone Richard had used with him for the past year. "What did you do?" Richard said, before Ryan could even explain why he was calling his words, clipped and sharp, with barely controlled panic. "The office is locked down. Federal marshals, Ryan. Every account is frozen, including the $400,000 you wired me yesterday. It's gone, all of it. Do you understand what that means?" Ryan stood frozen in the hallway, the ambient noise of the restaurant suddenly distant and unreal around him. "What are you talking about?" he managed. "That money came from my mother's property, Richard. That was supposed to secure my partnership stake." "There is no partnership," Richard said, his voice rising now, careless of who might hear. "There is no company left to be a partner in. Someone with serious legal power just dismantled everything I built in the space of one morning, and I need to know right now whether it has anything to do with you or your family. Because if federal investigators start pulling threads, Ryan, they are going to find that power of attorney, and they are going to find your name all over it." Ryan's mouth went dry. "How do you know about the power of attorney?" he asked, though. Even as the words left him, he understood the answer. Understood that he had, at some point in the frenzy of arranging that loan, described the document's origins to Richard, in more detail than he should have, eager to prove he had the resources and the resourcefulness to belong at that table. "I know because you told me," Richard snapped. "And I am telling you now, if this comes apart, I am not going down alone for something you engineered to buy your way into my family." The call ended before Ryan could respond, and he stood in that hallway for a long moment, his mind racing through possibilities before dialing the one number he had never expected to need in quite this way. It rang twice, and then, unexpectedly, his father picked up. "Dad," Ryan said, his voice cracking slightly, unable to fully suppress the panic now flooding through him. "Something is happening. My cards aren't working. Richard says everything's frozen, some kind of federal lockout. Do you know anything about this? Did you call someone? Did you say something to the bank?" On the other end of the line, Frank Callahan sat in his study, a recording device already active on the desk beside him, a habit he had adopted years earlier for legitimate business purposes, and now employed with an entirely different purpose in mind. He said nothing for a long moment, allowing the silence to stretch, allowing his son's panic room to fill that silence with his own assumptions. "I don't know what you're talking about," Frank finally said, his voice carefully neutral. "What exactly did you do to end up in this situation, son?" The question landed exactly as Frank intended it to land, striking the precise nerve of a man desperate to be understood as clever rather than caught, and Ryan, cornered and humiliated and unable to bear the idea that his father might think him a fool rather than a mastermind, began to talk. He described in increasingly reckless detail exactly how he had obtained his mother's signature on the power of attorney, exactly how he had used it to transfer the northern acreage, exactly how proud he had been of engineering the entire arrangement without anyone noticing. "She barely even read the papers," Ryan said, an edge of bitter defensive pride creeping into his voice, as though explaining a clever business maneuver to a father he still even now needed to impress. "I just told her it was insurance paperwork. She trusted me completely. It's not like I hurt her dad. I just needed the leverage, and it worked until whatever this has happened." Frank closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the full, unfiltered confession pouring out of his son's mouth into a recording device that would within hours become the cornerstone of a federal case. "Enjoy the rest of your evening, Ryan," he said quietly, and ended the call before his son could say another word. I sat alone in my study for a long time after that call ended, the recording device still glowing faintly on the desk beside me, the small red light indicating the file had saved successfully, feeling in that moment like the quiet blinking eye of something irreversible. I played the recording back once, start to finish, my son's voice, filling that familiar room with words I would give almost anything to have never heard him say. "She barely even read the papers. It's not like I hurt her." Each sentence landed like a fresh wound, though by the third listen, I had forced myself into the clinical detachment the situation required, cataloging each admission the way I might once have cataloged enemy positions on a battlefield map. Not because the emotion had disappeared, but because emotion indulged too fully in that moment would have served no one. I called Sam just after midnight, and he picked up on the first ring, the alertness in his voice, telling me he had been half expecting this call since our conversation weeks earlier about aiming a weapon in the dark. "I have what we need," I told him, and I described the recording in full, watching the study window as I spoke, the dark shape of the north field barely visible against the night sky beyond the glass. Everything, Sam. The forged authority, the timeline, his own words explaining exactly how he deceived her. Sam was quiet for a moment. "Frank," he said finally, his voice careful in a way that told me he understood exactly what he was about to ask. "Once I have this recording formally in the file, once it's part of the evidentiary record, there's no pulling it back. You understand that. The moment we hand this to federal investigators alongside the property fraud, your son becomes the subject of a criminal case that neither of us can control the outcome of. I need to hear you say you're certain. I looked at Michael's photograph on the corner of my desk, the young man in dress uniform, who had never once in his entire short life needed his father to make an excuse for him. And I thought of Eleanor sleeping upstairs, still believing her son's visit that Sunday had been nothing more than good news warmly shared. I thought of the 6 pages she had signed with a trembling hand, believing herself cared for in the very moment she was being emptied of her own legal protections. I'm certain I told Sam, and I meant it. Though certainty and peace are not the same thing, and I felt none of the latter as I said it. Sam walked me through the process that would follow over the coming days, the way the recording would be authenticated, cross-referenced against the property records, and the loan documents his team had already compiled, packaged into a formal referral to federal investigators already circling Doyle Capital Ventures, given the scale of fraud Richard had perpetrated against dozens of other investors. Ryan's actions, Sam explained gently, would very likely be prosecuted separately from Richard's larger fraud case, given the specific nature of elder financial abuse charges, but the outcome for both men was unlikely to be merciful once the full scope of evidence reached a courtroom. There's something else you should consider, Sam added, carefully before we move forward. Given the severity of what Ryan did specifically to Eleanor, and given that the fraudulent document specifically targeted her, not you, this decision technically belongs to both of you, not just you alone. Have you told her yet what actually happened that day in September? The question sat heavy in the dark study because I had been quietly avoiding exactly that conversation for the 3 weeks since I first understood what Ryan had done, telling myself I was protecting her from unnecessary pain. While some part of me understood, I was also protecting myself from having to watch her face when she finally understood how completely her own son had used her grief against her. Not yet, I admitted. I need to tell her before this goes any further. I climbed the stairs sometime after 1 in the morning and stood in the doorway of our bedroom for a long moment, watching Eleanor sleep peacefully, unaware that within days, her entire understanding of that September afternoon would need to be rewritten. I did not wake her that night. I told myself it was mercy letting her have one more undisturbed night of sleep before the truth arrived, though I suspect, looking back, it was also simply cowardice wearing Mercy's clothing. The last few hours I would ever have of a marriage untouched by this particular grief. I sat in the armchair by our bedroom window until dawn, watching the sky slowly lighten over the north field, rehearsing over and over the words I would need to find in the morning to tell my wife that the son she trusted completely had once looked into her medicated, grieving eyes and decided her signature was worth more to him than her well-being. Eleanor came downstairs that morning, already sensing something in the set of my shoulders, the particular stillness I carry when I am holding something too heavy to set down easily. She poured her coffee and sat across from me at the kitchen table, studying my face with the quiet attentiveness of a woman who had spent 41 years learning to read every shift in my expression. "Frank," she said, "what's wrong?" I told her everything as gently as truth allows. Starting with the September afternoon in the kitchen, the folder Ryan had brought the words, "insurance paperwork," that had never meant what she believed them to mean. I watched her face change as I spoke, watched the confusion give way slowly to a dawning, horrified understanding, and then finally, to a grief that had nothing to do with property lines or legal documents, and everything to do with the specific violation of discovering that her own child had looked at her vulnerability and calculated how to use it. She was quiet for a long time after I finished staring down at her coffee cup. Her hands wrapped around it, though she had stopped drinking from it several minutes earlier. He held my hand while I signed. She finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. I remember thinking how lucky I was that he turned out so thoughtful. I reached across the table and took her hand. The same hand that had signed those pages 6 weeks earlier, and said nothing, because there was nothing I could say that would soften what she was feeling in that moment. And I had learned long ago that some grief simply needs to be witnessed rather than fixed. "I don't understand how he could," she said eventually, her eyes finally lifting to meet mine, wet but steady. "Not for the money, Frank. I could almost understand desperation. But he watched me signing those pages the day we visit Michael. He knew what day it was. He knew." "I don't have an answer for you that will make this easier," I told her honestly. "I have spent 3 weeks trying to find one, and I haven't." She sat with that for a long moment, and then, in a gesture that told me more about her strength than anything else could have, she straightened her shoulders, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and asked, in a voice that had found its steadiness again, "What happens now?" I told her about the recording about Sam's plan to formally submit everything to federal investigators, about the fact that once that process began, there would be no controlling how far it went for either Ryan or Richard. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she nodded slowly. "Do it," she said. And there was something in her voice I had not heard in years, the echo of the young woman who used to argue fiercely for what she believed was right, regardless of whose comfort it disturbed. "He needs to understand that love isn't something you can spend without ever paying it back." 400 miles away in the wreckage of his own collapsed empire, Richard Doyle sat in a conference room with 3 defense attorneys, having spent the previous 2 days learning exactly how deep the federal investigation into his business practices actually ran. When one of the attorneys mentioned almost in passing that prosecutors seemed to be building a parallel case involving elder financial fraud connected to the property that had served as Doyle Capital's collateral, Richard's expression shifted into something calculating and cold. "That's not my exposure," he said quickly. "That's entirely on my son-in-law. He obtained that power of attorney fraudulently. I had no knowledge of how he acquired his mother's signature. If your strategy is to separate my liability from his gentleman, I suggest we lean into that distinction as hard as possible." Vanessa, sitting silently at the end of the table, where she had insisted on attending, despite her father's objections, felt something inside her go very still and very cold as she listened to her father calmly plan to sacrifice her husband to protect himself. She thought of the wedding she had planned so carefully, the partnership she had believed Ryan was building the entire foundation of security she had assumed her family represented, and understood, with sudden and complete clarity, that every version of stability she had ever believed in had been built on exactly the same kind of fraud her father was now so casually discussing. She stood abruptly gathering her purse and walked out of that conference room without a word, leaving her father mid-sentence already understanding that whatever came next, she intended to face it as someone entirely separate from both the men who had built their fortunes real or imagined on other people's trust. 5 months passed between the day Sam submitted our evidence to federal investigators and the morning I finally sat beside Eleanor on a hard wooden bench in a federal courtroom, watching 2 men who had once seemed untouchable let in wearing prison-issued jumpsuits instead of the tailored suits I remembered from that autumn wedding reception, where all of this had truly begun. The courtroom was fuller than I expected, financial journalists and curious onlookers filling most of the gallery, drawn by the scale of Richard Doyle's fraud, which investigators had ultimately traced across dozens of victims and nearly $19 million in losses once the full accounting was complete. Ryan looked smaller than I remembered him, his shoulders drawn inward, his eyes fixed on the scarred table in front of him, rather than meeting anyone's gaze. Richard beside him seemed to have aged a decade. In 5 months, his hair gone entirely gray, his posture stripped of every trace of the confident swagger I had witnessed only once briefly at that wedding, where he had commanded the room like a man who owned it. The judge entered a stern woman with the particular gravity of someone who had spent decades handling financial crimes and elder abuse cases, and had long since stopped being surprised by the specific cruelties human beings were capable of inflicting on the people who trusted them most. She addressed Richard first, methodically working through the scale of his fraud, the number of victims the years of deception required to sustain a scheme of that size, before sentencing him to 8 years in federal prison and a permanent ban from ever again holding an executive position at any company. Richard's shoulders sagged at the sentence, though he did not weep the way I had half expected. He simply sat very still, as though the number itself had not yet fully registered the particular numbness of a man whose entire identity had been built on being seen as powerful, and now found himself utterly publicly powerless. Then the judge turned her attention to Ryan, and the courtroom seemed to grow quieter still. She spoke about the specific cruelty of financial crimes committed against family members, about the particular breach of trust involved in exploiting a grieving medicated woman on the anniversary of her own son's death. She noted for the record that Ryan had cooperated fully once confronted with the recorded evidence that he had not contested the charges, and that this cooperation had factored into her sentencing decision, though it did not erase the underlying severity of what he had done. I watched my son's face as she spoke. Searching for some sign of the boy, I remembered the child who used to fall asleep in the truck after Little League practice, and found instead a man who seemed for the first time in longer than I could clearly recall genuinely present with the full weight of his own actions, rather than performing confidence for an audience. The judge sentenced Ryan to 4 years in federal prison, a fraction of the sentence Richard received, reflecting both his cooperation and the specific circumstances the court had weighed, though 4 years still landed in that courtroom with a finality that made Eleanor's hand tighten around mine on the bench beside me. Ryan did not look toward us as the sentence was read. He kept his eyes fixed on the table, his jaw working silently, and I understood, watching him, that whatever conversation still needed to happen between us would not happen in this room under these circumstances in front of strangers. The prosecutor rose after the sentencing to announce that the court would hear a victim impact statement, and I felt Eleanor's hand release mine gently as she nodded toward the podium, giving me the quiet permission we had discussed weeks earlier, that I would be the one to speak, since some of what needed saying required a father's particular authority rather than a mother's grief. I adjusted my jacket, and walked down the center aisle toward the podium, aware of every eye in that courtroom following me, though I found once I reached the microphone and looked out at the room that I felt none of the performative anger the gallery seemed to be waiting for. I felt instead a strange, settled calm, the particular clarity that comes after months of difficult decisions, finally arriving at the moment they were always leading toward. I am not here for vengeance. I began, my voice steady in the quiet room. Vengeance is driven by emotion, and I no longer have much emotion left for the men sitting at that table. I am here because my wife deserves to have the truth spoken plainly in a room where it cannot be denied or softened, about exactly what was taken from her and why. I told the court about the boy I raised, the one who used to help me wash the truck on Saturday mornings, who promised me once, at maybe 8 years old, that he would build his mother a bigger house someday, because she deserved one. I described the slow, quiet way ambition can curdle into something else entirely when a person begins measuring their worth by what other people notice rather than by what they actually build. I told them Ryan did not commit this crime out of desperation or need. He committed it because he wanted a seat at a table he believed his own family could never offer him, and he decided in the end that his mother's safety was an acceptable price for that seat. I paused for a moment, letting the silence stretch through the courtroom, and then I turned away from the judge and looked directly at my son. He lifted his head slowly, as though the weight of my attention alone required physical effort, and met my eyes for the first time since the sentencing had been read. "You spent your whole life believing your mother and I were small people," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the courtroom speakers. "You thought we lacked ambition because we drove old cars and lived in a modest house. You were so desperate to sit at what you believed was a bigger table that you forged your mother's trust to buy a partnership in a company that turned out to be built on nothing but lies, the same way I suppose you had already learned to build things on lies yourself." I let that land, watching something shift behind his eyes before I continued. "What you never understood, Ryan, is that the holding company that owns the building, your partnership operated out of the trust that triggered the lockout that ended everything you thought you had built that company as mine. Ironwood Holdings. I have spent 40 years building it quietly, deliberately, specifically so that you and your brother would never have to know the fear I grew up with. The fear of having nothing and no one willing to catch you." Ryan's breathing seemed to stop entirely. I watched the color drain slowly from his face as the full architecture of what he had done and what he had never known assembled itself behind his eyes. "I never told you or Michael the full scope of what I built," I continued, "because I wanted you both to learn your own worth rather than lean on mine." Michael understood that without ever needing the money explained to him. He built his own honor the hard way, and he never once in his entire life made me ashamed of the name he carried. I wanted the same chance for you. I paused again, and this final piece of truth felt heavier in my chest than anything else I had carried through this entire ordeal, heavier even than the recording, heavier than the sentencing itself. "There is a trust," I said, my voice steady, though the words cost me everything to speak plainly in that room. "Established years ago in both your names, holding the majority of what I built. You did not need to forge your mother's signature to secure a future, Ryan. You did not need Richard Doyle's fake empire to prove yourself worthy of anything. You already had everything waiting for you. All you needed to do was be a decent son." The silence that followed was the most complete I have ever experienced in a public room. Ryan's mouth opened slightly, though no sound emerged, his eyes wide with an expression I had never before seen on his face. Not confusion exactly, but something closer to the specific horror of a man realizing in a single devastating instant the true size of what his own greed had actually cost him. He had traded an inheritance built over 4 decades for a bankrupt import scheme and a marriage built on the same fraud that had just destroyed him. I did not wait for him to find words. I do not believe there were any words adequate to that particular moment. I stepped back from the podium, walked down the aisle, and returned to my seat beside Eleanor, who took my hand. Once more, her eyes wet, but her posture straight and unbowed, a woman who had finally, after everything, said everything that needed saying. I found Vanessa waiting in the courthouse hallway after the sentencing, standing apart from the small crowd of journalists who had gathered near the exit, her posture different than I remembered from the wedding I had watched from across a muddy patio all those months earlier. Gone was the practiced auteur, replaced by something quieter, more exhausted, the particular fatigue of a young woman who had spent the past several months relearning everything she believed about her own life. She approached me hesitantly as Eleanor and I made our way toward the doors, and I stopped curious, despite everything, to hear what she might want to say. "Mr. Callahan," she said, and I noticed she could not quite meet Eleanor's eyes, though she managed to hold mine. I wanted to say, "I'm sorry," for that night at the party. What I said to you, Mrs. Callahan, sending you to the kitchen like that. I've thought about it more than you probably realize. Eleanor beside me was quiet for a moment, studying the younger woman, with an expression I recognized from 4 decades of watching my wife extend grace to people who had not always earned it easily. Thank you for saying that Eleanor finally said, her voice gentle, but not without its own quiet firmness. I hope you find your way to something better than what your father built for you. Vanessa's eyes filled, and she looked away briefly before continuing. I filed for divorce last week, she said. From Ryan. I know that probably doesn't matter to either of you right now, given everything else. But I wanted you to know I'm not staying in any of it. Not my father's mess, not the marriage that was built on top of it. I'm starting over. I studied her for a long moment, this young woman who had once seemed to me the very picture of careless cruelty, and found myself considering, not for the first time since this ordeal began, how thoroughly a person's circumstances can shape the face they choose to show the world, and how much courage it can require to finally set that face down. That's a harder thing than it sounds, I told her, honestly. Starting over usually is. She nodded, wiping her eyes quickly with the back of her hand, the gesture oddly reminiscent of Eleanor's own composure in that kitchen months earlier. For what it's worth, she said, Ryan talks about the farm sometimes, about his brother. I don't think he ever really let himself think about Michael honestly until all of this happened. I don't know if that means anything to you. I just thought you should know he's not entirely lost in there. I did not have an answer for that. Not one I trusted myself to speak aloud, without my voice betraying more than I intended. So I simply thanked her for telling us, and watched her walk away down that long courthouse hallway, alone, toward whatever life she intended to quietly build for herself. Now that the only foundations she had ever known had, both in the span of a single season, collapsed entirely. Eleanor took my arm as we walked toward the parking lot, the April sun unexpectedly warm against the cold stone steps of the courthouse. Do you think she'll be all right? Eleanor asked. I think she has a better chance than either of us gave her credit for, I said, and found to my own quiet surprise that I actually believed it. I did not visit Ryan for the first 4 months of his sentence. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to tell this part of the story as though healing arrived in a straight, dignified line, and it did not. Eleanor asked me every few weeks whether I intended to go, and every few weeks I found some reason to say, not yet, telling myself I needed more time. Though I understood somewhere beneath that excuse that I was simply afraid of what I might feel sitting across a plexiglass divider from the boy I had spent months methodically helping to convict. It was Sam, of all people, who finally pushed me toward it. He called one evening in late July, ostensibly, about an unrelated matter concerning the northern acreage, and near the end of the conversation, in the careful sideways manner of a man who has earned the right to say difficult things, he asked whether I had any plans to see my son. You built cases against men for 30 years, Frank, he said. You know better than anyone that consequences without any path back toward decency don't actually accomplish anything beyond punishment. Is punishment all you're after here? I did not have a good answer for him that night, and I sat with the question for nearly 2 weeks before I finally called the facility and scheduled a visitation slot for the following Saturday. The visiting room was nothing like the courtroom. No grandeur, no weight of ceremony, just rows of scuffed plastic tables bolted to the floor, fluorescent lights humming overhead, the low murmur of other families conducting their own difficult reunions around us. I sat down across from a guard station and waited, my hands folded on the table, in a posture that reminded me uncomfortably of every negotiation I had ever conducted across a boardroom table, except that no version of my training had prepared me for the particular vulnerability of waiting to see my own son in a place like this. Ryan looked different than he had at the sentencing. Leaner, his hair cut shorter than he had worn it in years, and there was something in the way he walked toward the table, some absence of the performance I had watched him carry his entire adult life, that struck me before he had even sat down. He did not smile. He did not offer the easy charm he had once used to smooth over every uncomfortable moment. He simply sat, folded his hands, the mirror image of mine, and looked at me with an expression I had not seen on his face since he was a very small boy, caught in some minor forgivable lie. "I didn't think you'd come," he said. Finally, his voice quieter than I remembered it. "I almost didn't," I told him honestly. "I wasn't sure what I still had to say to you that hadn't already been said in that courtroom." He nodded slowly, looking down at his hands for a long moment before speaking again. "I've had a lot of time to think in here," he said. "More than I ever wanted. I keep coming back to that day at the hospital. Not the wedding, not any of the money. That day, with Mom. I keep trying to understand how I looked at her, and decided that was something I could do. I did not offer him an easy absolution, because I did not believe then or now that easy absolution was mine to give or his to receive so quickly. "Did you find an answer?" I asked instead. "I think I wanted to matter to people who never actually cared. Whether I mattered at all," he said, his voice cracking slightly on the last few words. "And I decided the two people who actually did care were safe to hurt, because I figured you'd always forgive me eventually." I never thought about what that actually meant for Mom. I just thought about what I needed. It was the first fully honest thing I had heard my son say, in longer than I could clearly remember, and I felt something in my chest loosened slightly. Not forgiveness exactly. Not yet, but something adjacent to it. Some small opening where forgiveness might eventually be able to grow if he continued walking toward it, rather than away. "Your mother is healing," I told him. Slowly. "She asked me to tell you she still loves you, though she needed time before she could say that herself. That's something you're going to have to earn back with her, Ryan. Not with an apology. With years of actually being different." I know he said, and for once I believed him. "I want to write to her, if she's willing." I told him I would ask her, and I did that same evening, and Eleanor sat with the question for several days before finally drafting a short, careful letter of her own, the first small thread in what would become, over the following months, a slow and uneven correspondence between mother and son, built one honest page at a time, rather than the 6 pages that had once cost her so much. I left that visiting room with no illusions about how long or how uncertain the road ahead of us actually was. But I left it for the first time since that October evening at the Doyle estate, with something I had not expected to feel again anytime soon. Not peace, not yet. Something quieter and more fragile than that. The first small, careful shape of hope. The farmhouse looked different in the pale gold light of early April than it had that October evening when Eleanor and I first drove home from the Doyle estate in silence. The north field had greened up early that spring, the memorial stone at its edge freshly cleared of winter's debris, and I found myself standing there most mornings, now coffee in hand, watching the sun climb over land that had very nearly slipped from our family's hands entirely. The farm belonged to us again, fully and cleanly. The fraudulent transfer, voided the same week the criminal case concluded, the collateral arrangement dissolved, along with the rest of Richard Doyle's collapsed empire. Eleanor had taken to spending her mornings out here as well, tending a small garden bed she'd planted near Michael's stone. Something she told me helped her feel useful. Again, helped her reclaim a piece of ground that had briefly belonged to strangers. Ryan writes to us now once every few weeks, letters rather than phone calls since the facility, where he's serving his sentence limits calls, but not correspondence. The first letters were difficult to read, full of a shame so raw it was almost unbearable to witness even at a distance. But they have changed slowly over these past months, growing less about his own suffering and more about genuine reflection, about the specific weight of finally understanding what his mother's trust had actually meant, and what it had cost her to have it broken. He asked in his most recent letter whether he might visit his brother's memorial when he's released, whether Eleanor would be willing to walk that field with him again someday. I don't know yet what kind of relationship we'll be able to rebuild, if any real rebuilding is even possible after this. But I've learned something over these past months that I want to share, something I wish someone had told me many years earlier, when Ryan was still small enough to fall asleep in the truck on the drive home from practice. Unconditional love does not mean unconditional surrender. For years, I believed that being a good father meant shielding my sons from every hard consequence, meant quietly absorbing whatever damage they caused, rather than risking the relationship by holding them accountable. I have come to understand that this instinct, however well-intentioned, can become its own kind of harm. Protection without boundaries does not raise strong men. It raises men who never learn that other people's trust is not a resource to be spent without consequence. The hardest thing I have ever done was choosing to let the law take its course with my own son, knowing exactly what it would cost him, knowing it might cost me any relationship with him at all. But I have come to believe that real love sometimes requires exactly that kind of hard honesty, the willingness to let someone face what they've earned, rather than rescuing them from the truth of their own choices. Anything less isn't love. It's just fear wearing love's clothing. Eleanor healed slower than I expected, and in some ways, differently than I expected. She no longer carries the guilt she once felt, the quiet, mistaken belief that somehow she had failed as a mother, that Ryan's choices reflected some deficiency in how we raised him. She has come to understand what I came to understand watching Michael grow into the man he became, and Ryan grow into the man he temporarily lost himself, as that we can give our children every tool, every value, every ounce of love we possess, and they still choose ultimately how to use what we've given them. That choice was never ours to make for him, and it was never ours to carry the shame of either. What I hope people take from our story, if you've stayed with me this long, is simply this. If you have ever had to make the difficult choice to hold someone accountable, even someone you love, more than your own life, even when it broke your heart to do it, you were not being cruel. You were teaching the only lesson that sometimes actually sticks, the lesson that every choice we make ripples outward into consequences we cannot always control once we've set them in motion. That is not punishment. That is simply how the world at its most honest actually works. I still walk out to that north field most mornings, coffee in hand, and I still talk to Michael sometimes, the way you do with people you've lost, telling him about the garden Eleanor planted, about his brother's letters, about the slow, uncertain work of rebuilding a family that broke in ways none of us saw coming. I don't know exactly what the coming years hold for Ryan, for any of us, but I know Eleanor is healing. I know this land is ours, again clean and whole. And I know that somewhere in a facility a few states away, my son is finally, for the first time in longer than I can remember, being honest with himself about who he wants to become. If you've ever had to set a hard boundary with someone you love, if you've ever had to choose honesty over comfort, to protect the people who matter most, I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. And if this story meant something to you, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.